You'll eat what the mountain doesn't finish. Laughter rippled softly around the dinner table, but it wasn't the kind of laughter that warms a room. It was brittle, sharp, the kind that cuts. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. For a heartbeat, the words just hung there in the air, shimmering like heat over asphalt. I looked at my daughter-in-law, Lauren, her smile tight and eyes glinting with the satisfaction of someone who thought she'd scored the perfect joke. She was carving into her steak, thick, juicy, marbled, just right. The kind of steak I'd bought dozens of times for this family. The family whose bills I'd often settled when Daniel lost his job. The family whose children I'd often picked up from school and after-school activities so Daniel and Lauren could work late. The family for whom I had been nothing less than a walking financial pillar for over a decade. But now at 76, I, Arthur Miller, was apparently fit to eat a scrap no better than the family dog's leftovers. A younger me, say, the man who'd built a successful engineering firm from the ground up, might have laughed it off, pretending the sting wasn't real, or maybe smiled politely, swallowing the barb alongside cold roast potatoes. But tonight, something inside me refused. The comment didn't just land, it rooted like a thorn catching in fabric. I felt heat rise in my cheeks, not from shame, but from clarity. I had been stepping over these small insults for years, telling myself they weren't worth a scene. And every time the pile of swallowed words grew heavier. Tonight, I thought, setting my fork down with care. Maybe it's time I stopped swallowing anything, scraps or insults. I didn't say a word. Instead, I reached across the table, my hand steady, and took the untouched half of Lauren's steak right from her plate. Her eyes widened, her knife still poised midair. Daniel froze beside her, his wine glass halfway to his lips. Without breaking eye contact, I stood, walked to the corner where Max, their golden retriever, lay curled up on his bed, and placed the steak gently into his bowl. Max blinked at me in happy confusion, sniffed the meat, and began eating with a loud, wet enthusiasm that filled the sudden silence. When I returned to my seat, the air was thick enough to cut with the knife Lauren was still gripping. "Well," I said calmly, reaching for my water, "I suppose now we'll both find out how much the dog leaves me." A choked laugh escaped from the far end of the table. My granddaughter Claire, she quickly covered her mouth, but not before I caught the flash of understanding, almost pride in her eyes. Lauren's face flushed a deep crimson. "That was a joke," she managed to say, her voice brittle. "I know," I replied evenly, cutting into my own potato. So was mine. Nobody spoke for the rest of the meal. Only the scrape of cutlery and Max's happy chewing filled the room. But under the table, Claire's foot found mine, giving it the smallest, most deliberate squeeze. And in that quiet moment, I knew she understood exactly what had just shifted. I stood by the kitchen window, watching them after dinner. Daniel loaded dishes into the dishwasher while Lauren dried them with jerky, irritated movements. They didn't speak to each other. Not really, but their silence was charged, as if my small act at the table had been an earthquake neither of them had prepared for. I dried my hands, hung the towel neatly on its hook, and sat back down at the table where my coffee cup still waited. I wasn't in a hurry to leave. Not yet. Let them feel the weight of my presence, the same way I'd felt the weight of theirs all these years. Except mine had been heavy with obligation, theirs with quiet judgment. As I stirred the coffee, I let my mind drift back. There had been a time when this kitchen, their kitchen, had felt like an extension of my own. A time when I'd arrive at dawn to make breakfast for the children, so Daniel and Lauren could sleep in after late work shifts. When I'd spend my own pension on school uniforms, piano lessons, orthodontics, and vacations, I wasn't even invited to join. Back then, I didn't think of it as sacrifice. I thought of it as love, the natural duty of a father and grandfather. After all, Daniel was my only child. I'd raised him alone after his mother, Eleanor, died of a heart attack when Daniel was still in high school. Every win he had felt like mine too. Every burden I took onto my shoulders without question. When he married Lauren, I told myself that she just needed time to adjust to my way of doing things. She was younger, ambitious, sharp-tongued in a way that could be mistaken for wit if you didn't stand in the line of fire. At first, she seemed grateful for the down payment I gave them for their first house, for the weekends I spent babysitting Claire and little Thomas so they could travel, for the grocery runs when money was tight. But gratitude is a fragile thing. Somewhere along the years, it curdled into expectation. The thank yous stopped. The requests became instructions, and the instructions became assumptions. I remembered the first time I truly felt the shift. It was the Christmas I bought them a new car after theirs broke down. Lauren had opened the card, read the note, and said, "Good, we needed that." No hug, no smile, just those 4 clipped words before she moved on to the next gift. I told myself not to mind. After all, it's not about thanks. It's about helping family. But now, as I sat in their dining room with the echo of her dog Scrap's comments still ringing in my ears, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake in letting those moments pass unchallenged. Claire appeared in the doorway, her hair loose now, wearing the oversized sweatshirt I'd bought her last winter. She gave me a quick, almost conspiratorial smile and slipped into the seat beside me. "Grandpa," she said in a whisper only I could hear, "that was the best thing I've ever seen you do." I raised an eyebrow, sipping my coffee. "Feeding the dog?" She grinned. "Feeding the dog her dinner? You should have seen her face." Her voice was hushed, but there was a bright spark in her eyes, something that told me she understood exactly what that moment meant, even if the rest of them pretended otherwise. "Sometimes," I said slowly, "you have to speak a language people understand." Claire's smile faded into something softer. They shouldn't talk to you like that." Her words warmed me, but they also cut deep because Claire was 17. Still young enough to see unfairness clearly, but old enough to recognize it when it became part of the fabric of everyday life. And she was right. They shouldn't talk to me like that. They shouldn't treat me like that. Lauren's voice floated in from the kitchen. "Daniel, your father still here?" The tone was polite enough, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. A subtle push toward the door. I set my coffee down. "Well, I should be going," I told Claire, though neither of us moved right away. She reached under the table again and gave my hand a quick squeeze before standing. In the hallway, I collected my coat from the stand. Daniel walked me to the door, his smile stiff. "Thanks for coming, Dad," he said as if we just had a pleasant evening. I looked at him for a long moment. My son, the boy I'd once taught to ride a bike, now a man with fine lines around his eyes, and a guardedness in his tone that I couldn't quite break through anymore. "Good night, Daniel," I said simply, stepping out into the cool evening air. The wind tugged at my scarf as I walked to my car. In the quiet of the street, the absurdity of it all struck me. Years of giving, years of bending over backwards, and it had come down to this: a stake, a D, and a line I hadn't realized I'd been waiting to cross. As I slid behind the wheel, I felt no regret, only a growing certainty that this was not going to be one isolated act of defiance. Tonight had simply been the opening move, and for the first time in a long while, I was curious, almost eager to see what would happen when I stopped playing by their rules. The next afternoon, Claire showed up at my door without warning. She was still in her school clothes, plaid skirt, blazer half-buttoned, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. "I told Mom I was going to study at Mia's," she said, stepping inside before I could answer. "I needed to see you." I took her coat, hung it on the hook, and gestured toward the kitchen. "Tea?" She nodded, following me in. "I've been thinking about what happened last night," she said as I filled the kettle. It was amazing, but it also made me realize how much you put up with." I set 2 cups on the table, trying to hide my smile. "You've been thinking, have you?" "Yes." She leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Grandpa, they don't appreciate you. They take advantage of you, and it's not fair. I mean, I knew it before, but last night it was so obvious, the way Mom looked at you." She trailed off, shaking her head. Her words sat heavy between us. I'd had these same thoughts countless times over the years, but hearing them from her was different. It was like having a mirror held up and realizing your reflection looked more tired than you'd allowed yourself to admit. "I've let it happen," I said quietly, "for a long time, but you don't have to anymore." Claire's eyes searched mine. "You're not stuck. You could..." She hesitated, looking almost guilty. "You could stop helping them so much. They wouldn't treat you like that if they knew you could just walk away." I laughed softly, not because it was funny, but because of her conviction. "It's not so easy, Claire. When you've spent years being the one who steps in, it's hard to step back out." She sat back in her chair, folding her arms. "Maybe it's hard, but it's not impossible. You've been there for them since forever. Who's been there for you?" Her question landed like a pebble in a still pond, rippling outward. Who had been there for me? Not Daniel, not in any real emotional way. Not Lauren, not even Thomas, though he was still young enough to be excused from such responsibility. "I guess," I said slowly, "the answer is you." Claire smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time you start thinking about yourself, because they're not going to." The kettle whistled and I poured the water into our cups. I watched the steam curl upward, disappearing into the air. Like so many years I'd poured into that household, vanishing without acknowledgement. We talked for another hour about her classes, her plans after graduation, the part-time job she was hoping to get at the local bookstore. But the undercurrent of the conversation never shifted. She was worried about me, and maybe for the first time I was willing to admit I should be worried about me too. When she finally stood to leave, she hugged me tighter than usual. "You're stronger than you think, Grandpa," she said into my shoulder. After she left, I sat at the kitchen table for a long while, her words echoing in my head. Stronger than I think. Maybe it was time to find out if she was right. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, the darkness pressing in, my mind playing an endless reel of moments I'd let slide. Lauren telling me my suit jacket was too old-fashioned for the family Christmas photo. Daniel asking for just a small loan and never mentioning it again. Birthdays where the children opened my gifts and tossed them aside without a second glance. I had always told myself I didn't mind, that it was normal, that family doesn't keep score. But lying there with the moonlight spilling across my bedroom ceiling, I realized it wasn't about keeping score. It was about respect. And somewhere along the way, mine had been quietly taken from me. I thought about what Claire had said. "They're not going to think about you." She was right. When Eleanor died, I'd filled the emptiness with their needs. I'd poured my time, my money, and my energy into Daniel's family because I didn't know what else to do with all that love and all that need to be useful. And maybe I'd been afraid that if I didn't make myself indispensable, I'd fade into irrelevance. Another old man no one had time for. But now, after all these years, I could see the truth. I hadn't made myself indispensable. I'd made myself invisible, except when they wanted something. I got out of bed, pulled on my robe, and padded into the kitchen. The clock on the wall said 2:14 a.m. I put the kettle on, though I wasn't really craving tea. I just needed something to do with my hands. I opened the drawer where I keep my important papers, bank statements, insurance documents, the deeds to my house. The folders were neat, labeled, everything in its place. My eyes went to the thick ledger, meticulously kept, marked family accounts. It was thicker than the others. I pulled it out, sat at the table, and began leafing through it. There it all was in black and white. The $50,000 loan for Daniel's car, the $8,000 for Lauren's business course, thousands for summer camps, tuition fees, new appliances, vacation emergencies, line after line, year after year, each one a piece of me I'd given away without hesitation. I stared at the totals. The number was larger than I'd ever let myself calculate before. By the time the kettle whistled, I'd already made up my mind. This wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about the stake. It was about stopping the slow erosion of my dignity. And that meant one thing. I needed to take back control of my money, my time, and my place in this family. I poured myself a cup of tea, but I didn't drink it. I just sat there in the quiet, hands wrapped around the warm mug, and began to plan. Tomorrow I would start with the bank. The morning sunlight felt sharper than usual, cutting through the kitchen curtains like it had something to prove. I'd barely slept, but I was more awake than I'd been in months. I dressed deliberately, navy slacks, a crisp shirt, the sensible leather shoes I'd worn to Eleanor's memorial years ago, clothes that made me feel steady. I ate a light breakfast, not because I was hungry, but because I needed the ritual of it. At 9 o'clock sharp, I walked into the downtown branch of the bank I'd been using since Daniel was born. It was the same one where Eleanor and I had opened our first joint account, where we'd deposited paychecks and withdrawn cash for family vacations. But this time, my business was entirely my own. A young woman in a suit greeted me at the door. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. How can I help you today?" "I'd like to speak with a personal banker," I said. My voice sounded calm, almost too calm. "It's about my accounts." Within minutes, I was seated in a private office across from a man in his 40s named Richard, whose crisp suit and earnest demeanor told me he'd seen every kind of request, though perhaps not quite this one. "How can I assist you today?" he asked, hands poised over his keyboard. "I want to cancel all automatic transfers to my son Daniel's account," I said, "and I want to revoke the joint access he has to my savings." His fingers hesitated over the keys. "All transfers?" "Yes, every single one. And I want that access removed today if possible." Richard blinked but didn't question me. "I can certainly help with that. There will be some forms to sign, and I'll need to verify which accounts have linked permissions." I opened my bag and took out the ledger I'd studied last night. "I've listed them all for you, I said, sliding the paper across the desk. "And there are no exceptions." As Richard reviewed the list, I felt a strange sensation. Not guilt, not even anger, but a kind of release, like setting down a bag I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten its weight. "These are significant amounts," he remarked, scanning the page. "Some of them monthly, some quarterly. Are you certain you want to stop all of them at once?" I've never been more certain of anything in my life, I said. We went through each account one by one. Mortgage assistance, tuition payments, car insurance, credit card balances. I initialed and signed where needed, the black ink bold against the paper. When we finished, Richard printed confirmation copies for me to keep. All linked access has been removed, he said. The transfers are canceled. There may be 1 or 2 payments already in processing, but nothing further will go out after today. I slipped the papers back into my folder, then looked him in the eye. Thank you. I'd also like to open a new account, a trust account in my granddaughter Claire's name. I'll be the trustee until she turns 25. This time, Richard's smile seemed warmer. Of course, that's a wonderful idea. We spent the next 30 minutes setting up the account, arranging it so that the funds were protected from any outside claims, including family. I transferred a considerable sum, more than enough to cover Claire's education and give her a safe start in life. By the time I stepped out into the mid-morning air, I felt lighter, though the sun was no softer. It struck me that this was the first financial decision I'd made in years that was entirely about me or about someone I truly wanted to help without obligation or strings attached. My phone buzzed in my bag. Daniel's name flashed on the screen. I let it ring until it went to voicemail. A minute later, it buzzed again, this time a text. Dad, the bank says there's a problem with the transfers. Call me ASAP. I slipped the phone back into my bag and kept walking toward the bus stop. Let him figure it out. This morning, I'd taken back something far more valuable than money, and I wasn't about to give it up again. From the bank, I walked straight to the office of Peter Hanley, the attorney who had handled my will for the past 15 years. The brass plaque on the door looked the same as it always had, but I felt different as I reached for the handle. Peter greeted me warmly, his sandy hair now streaked with silver. Arthur, he said, shaking my hand, it's been too long. How are you? I've been better, I admit, but I'm about to get better still. He raised an eyebrow and gestured for me to sit. Sounds like we have business to discuss. I set my ledger on his desk. I want to make changes to my will, significant ones, and I'd like to establish a living trust for my granddaughter Claire. Peter leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. All right, let's start with the will. What do you have in mind? Daniel and his wife will no longer be my primary beneficiaries, I said plainly. Claire will inherit the bulk of my estate, and the trust will ensure she has access when she's responsible enough to handle it. Peter studied me for a moment. May I ask what prompted this change? They've shown me exactly how they value me, I replied. And it's not for who I am, just for what I can give them. He didn't press further, just nodded in that measured way good lawyers do when they know a client's mind is made up. We'll need to amend the will and set up the trust documents. The trust will protect the assets from claims, even from family members, and it will allow you to control distributions during your lifetime. That's exactly what I want, I said. For the next hour, we reviewed my assets, investments, and the house. Peter suggested language that would make my intentions airtight, no loopholes, no ambiguity. He also recommended appointing a secondary trustee in case something happened to me before Claire reached the age specified. I chose my old business partner, David, without hesitation. David had known me since we started our firm together. He'd seen me at my best and my worst, and more importantly, he'd never once tried to take advantage of me. When the draft documents were ready, Peter slid them across the desk. I read each line carefully before signing, my signature flowing more steadily than I'd expected. Arthur, he said, as he gathered the papers, I've been in this business a long time. I've seen families torn apart over far less. Are you prepared for the fallout? I met his eyes. I've been living with the fallout for years, Peter. I just didn't call it by its name. He smiled faintly, perhaps with a touch of pride. Then I'll have everything finalized within the week. You'll have certified copies for your records, and I'll retain the originals. I thanked him and stepped back out into the midday sun, the city humming around me. It was strange. I hadn't realized how much space those unspoken resentments had been taking up inside me until I began clearing them out. My phone buzzed again in my bag. This time it was a string of messages from Daniel. Dad, what's going on? Why are the transfers blocked? The mortgage is due next week. We need to talk. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked to the nearest cafe, ordered a sandwich and coffee, and sat by the window where I could watch people passing by. I let myself enjoy the simple act of buying lunch without checking if there was enough left over to cover someone else's request. For once, the money in my account and the choices it represented were entirely mine. I didn't know exactly how Daniel and Lauren would react when they realized these changes weren't temporary, But I did know one thing. I wouldn't be backing down. Not this time. By the time I got home, the answering machine was blinking like a warning light. I almost laughed. I hadn't seen that little red flash go off so many times since Claire was a baby, and Daniel used to call every night from college, asking for just a bit to help with rent. I pressed play. Dad, it's Daniel. I don't know what's going on, but the bank says you canceled the transfers. That's got to be a mistake. Call me back. Beep. Dad, it's me again. Lauren's furious. The mortgage is coming up, and look, can you please just call? We need to sort this out before it becomes a big problem. Beep. Arthur, Lauren's voice this time tight and clipped. I think we should all have a calm, adult conversation about whatever's troubling you. This isn't how families handle things. Please call me back. Beep. I erased them all without listening to the rest. I wasn't ready. Not for explanations, not for arguments, and certainly not for the tone Lauren used when she was trying to wrap her demands in politeness. The next call came live just after I'd sat down with a book. I saw Daniel's name flash across the screen and let it ring. He called again and again. Then Lauren. By the sixth call, I switched the phone to silent and set it face down on the coffee table. It was a strange thing, ignoring them. For years, their calls, whether to check in or to request something, had felt like obligations I couldn't refuse. A reflex to pick up, to say yes, to rearrange my day to fit their needs. But now the space between the rings felt like breathing room I hadn't known I was missing. Around 7, the phone buzzed with a text from Claire. Grandpa, Mom and Dad are losing it. What happened? They won't tell me anything except that you've done something drastic. Are you okay? I stared at the message for a while before typing back. I'm fine, dear. I'll explain soon. For now, don't get pulled into their drama. Focus on your homework. Within seconds, she replied, okay, just wanted to check on you. Love you. It was the only message that made me smile that day. The next morning, I found Lauren's car parked in front of my house. She was sitting in the driver's seat, tapping on her phone, her sunglasses hiding whatever expression she wore. I considered pretending I wasn't home, but then decided I didn't care enough to hide. When I stepped outside to get the mail, she rolled down her window. Arthur, she said, her voice sweet enough to make my teeth ache. We need to talk about, I asked, sorting through envelopes, about the bank, the payments, everything. I'm sure this is just a misunderstanding. Daniel says you have been a bit off lately. If something's bothering you, we can work it out. But cutting us off without a word, that's not fair. I looked at her over the edge of the electric bill in my hand. Lauren, I've been more than fair for years. Her lips pressed into a thin line. You're making things harder than they need to be. I almost laughed. Funny, I was thinking the same about you. Her sunglasses tilted slightly, like she was studying me for cracks. Daniel's under a lot of stress right now. The mortgage. The mortgage? I interrupted. Is yours. So are the cars, the vacations, and the dinners out. I'm done funding your lifestyle. Her mouth opened as if to protest, but I'd already turned toward my front door. I have things to do, I said over my shoulder. Drive safe. I shut the door before she could answer. For a long moment, I leaned against it, listening to the quiet tick of the clock in the hallway. My heart was beating faster than I wanted to admit, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the rush of finally saying no and meaning it. Through the front window, I watched Lauren's car linger for another minute before pulling away. The phone would ring again, the text would keep coming, and sooner or later, Daniel himself would show up. But when he did, I would be ready. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't standing on the defensive. I was standing on my own ground. Daniel didn't wait long to make his move. It was late Saturday morning, and I'd just finished tidying up the kitchen when I heard the crunch of tires on my driveway. I peeked through the curtains, Daniel's SUV. He was alone. That in itself was unusual. Lauren preferred to be part of any important discussion, especially if it involved money. He didn't bother knocking gently. 3 sharp raps rattled the door, followed by his voice. Dad, it's me. We need to talk. I took my time, walking to the door as if I hadn't been standing there already. When I opened it, he stood there with his hands shoved in his jacket pockets, his expression a mix of irritation and forced concern. Can I come in? He asked. You can, I said, stepping aside. Whether you should is another matter. He frowned but entered, glancing around as if expecting the place to look different, as if cutting him off financially would somehow redecorate my living room. All right, he began, dropping into the armchair without being invited. What's going on? The bank says you canceled all the transfers. Our mortgage payment bounced yesterday. I had to move money around to cover it. Then I suppose it's good you had money to move around, I said, settling onto the sofa. He exhaled sharply. Dad, come on. If you were upset about something, you could have told me. This drastic stunt doesn't help anyone. It helps me, I said evenly. It helps me remember that I am not your safety net, your emergency fund, or your automatic teller machine. His jaw tightened. This is about the other night, isn't it? Lauren's comment. She was joking, Dad. I let out a quiet laugh. If it were just one night, Daniel, you might be right. But it's not. It's years of being treated like my worth is measured only by what I can give you. Years of disrespect. Some subtle, some not. That dinner was simply the last straw. He shifted uncomfortably in the chair. You're blowing this out of proportion. We've always appreciated what you've done for us. Have you? I asked, leaning forward. When was the last time you called me just to ask how I was? Not because you needed something, not because a payment was due, just because you cared. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I watched the flicker of defensiveness cross his face, followed by the telltale look of someone searching for a safe answer and not finding one. I'm not saying we've been perfect, he said finally, but families are supposed to help each other. You taught me that. And I'm still willing to help when it's needed, I said. But needed doesn't mean bailing you out every month because you can't live within your means. It doesn't mean paying for luxuries while I'm told to be more frugal with my own needs. He rubbed his face with both hands. This is going to put us in a tough spot, Dad. We've got obligations. So do I cut in. Obligations to myself, to my peace of mind. I've spent years putting yours ahead of mine. That ends now. The room went quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Daniel looked at me for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to push harder or retreat. In the end, he stood abruptly. I think you're making a mistake, but I guess it's your choice. You're right, I said, it is. He headed for the door without another word. I followed him to the threshold, watching as he climbed into the SUV. He didn't look back before reversing out of the driveway. I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, not because I was shaken, though my hands were trembling slightly, but because I knew this wouldn't be the last confrontation. Lauren would try again. Daniel would too. They'd test the boundaries I'd just drawn, looking for any weakness. But they were going to find a different Arthur now, one who knew exactly where his limits were, one who had no intention of moving them ever again. Sunday morning came with the kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years. No early phone calls, no urgent requests, no reminders of bills that needed paying. I made coffee, fed the birds in the garden, and sat by the kitchen window as if nothing in the world was pressing me for an answer. The peace lasted until mid-afternoon when the inevitable knock came. This time it wasn't Daniel. Lauren stood on my porch in a tailored coat, her hair perfectly smooth, a bright red scarf knotted at her neck. She wore the expression of someone who'd rehearsed her lines on the drive over. Arthur, she said smoothly, I hope I'm not interrupting. You are, I replied. But you might as well come in. Her heels clicked across my hardwood floor as she entered, glancing around the room like she was checking for dust. She didn't sit until I did, and then she crossed her legs, leaning forward with practiced warmth. I'm here because I think we can clear this whole thing up, she began. There's no need for tension between us. Daniel tells me you've been feeling underappreciated. That's one way of putting it, I said, folding my hands in my lap. She gave a small laugh as if to soften the mood. Families have misunderstandings. We've all been under stress, and sometimes words come out wrong. About the other night, I held up a hand. Lauren, I'm not interested in excuses. What you said was deliberate, but it's not just about one comment. It's about years of treating me like my only value is in my wallet or my calendar. Her smile wavered, but she recovered quickly. You've always been generous, Arthur. We've never taken that for granted. Yes, you have, I said plainly. She blinked, taken aback by the directness. I've paid for your mortgage when Daniel's hours were cut. I've covered vacations, caused private school fees, business expenses, all without complaint. And not once in the last 5 years have you invited me into this home without expecting something in return. Not once have you asked how I am without it leading to a request. Lauren shifted in her chair. We appreciate everything you've done. Do you? I leaned forward slightly. Because appreciation doesn't sound like telling me I'll eat whatever the dog leaves. It doesn't look like excluding me from holidays I've paid for. And it doesn't feel like respect. For the first time since she'd arrived, Lauren's composure cracked. A faint flush crept up her neck. All right, she said, voice tightening. Maybe we've been careless, but cutting us off completely, that's punishing everyone for 1 or 2 bad moments. I sat back, my tone calm. It's not punishment, it's boundaries. You've lived without them for too long, and I've lived without them for even longer. That's over." We sat in silence for a moment, the ticking of the clock in the hallway filling the space. Lauren uncrossed and recrossed her legs, clearly realizing her usual tactics weren't working. "Think about it," she said at last, rising to her feet. "Don't make a decision you can't take back." I stood too, walking her to the door. "I already have." She paused on the threshold as if hoping for a last-second change of heart. I gave her none. When the door shut behind her, I didn't feel triumphant, just steady. That conversation hadn't been about winning. It had been about making it clear that the rules had changed, and no amount of charm or pressure was going to change them back. I knew this wasn't the end. If anything, it was the midpoint of a battle I hadn't planned for, but was now fully prepared to fight. And for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was the one holding the ground. By Monday morning, the family rumor mill was in full spin. I found out when my old business partner, David, called, his voice brimming with that mix of concern and barely concealed curiosity only a lifelong friend can get away with. "Arthur, I just ran into old man Henderson at the market," he said without preamble. "He tells me Daniel and Lauren are telling people you have lost your grip and cut them off over a misunderstanding." I let out a dry laugh. "Is that what they're calling it?" "That's the polite version," David replied. "Henderson hinted they're making it sound like you're being irrational. That you're, and I quote, not thinking straight lately." I shook my head even though he couldn't see it. "No, David, I'm more myself than I've been in years." His voice softened. "I figured as much. I told Henderson he'd be smart to keep his opinions to himself unless he knows the whole story. But you know how family gossip works. They'll turn this into something it's not." "I'm counting on it," I said. "It'll keep them talking and away from my doorstep at least for a little while." We chatted a bit longer, and after I hung up, I couldn't help but think about how quickly they'd shifted the narrative. It was almost impressive. In less than a week, I'd gone from generous patriarch to cold-hearted, potentially senile villain in their version of events. Later that day, I stopped by the grocery store. In the produce aisle, I caught sight of Lauren's sister, Patricia. We'd never been close, but she'd always been civil. Today, though, her greeting was cool, her smile thin. "Heard you've been making waves," she said, plucking a bag of apples from the display. "I suppose you could call it that," I replied. She gave a little shrug. "Family drama isn't my business, but you know how it looks when you pull the rug out from under your own son." I met her gaze evenly. "If you're going to judge, Patricia, at least judge the whole picture, not just the frame they've handed you." She didn't have much to say after that. When I got home, there was a message from Claire waiting on my phone. "Grandpa, people are talking. Mom's making it sound like you've had some kind of breakdown. I know it's not true, but just warning you." I sat down and typed back, "Let them talk, sweetheart. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard." Claire's reply came almost instantly. "Still, I'm proud of you." That evening, David came over with a pie. Blueberry, my favorite. We settled in at the kitchen table like we had hundreds of times before. "So," he said between bites, "what's your plan if they keep trying to twist the story?" "I don't need a plan," I said. They can say what they like. The people who matter will either know the truth or take the time to find it. The rest, well, their opinions aren't my problem anymore." David studied me for a moment. "You sound lighter." "I am," I admitted. "Do you know what it feels like to stop waiting for someone else's gratitude? To finally realize you don't need their approval to breathe?" He smiled. "Sounds like freedom to me." We spent the next hour talking about ordinary things, the weather, the garden, the latest mystery novel he was reading. And somewhere in that normal conversation, I felt the tight knot in my chest loosen just a little more. I knew the gossip would continue. I knew there'd be more attempts to fix me, more half-hearted reconciliations that were really about regaining access to what I'd taken away. But I also knew I had crossed a line I would never step back over. Let them talk. Let them speculate. I was finally living on my own terms, and I intended to keep it that way. By midweek, the whispers had turned into little storms that drifted through the family tree. You could almost feel them gathering weight, circling around me without ever landing directly, the way people talk when they want you to hear, but don't have the courage to say it to your face. It started at the post office. I was in line to send a package to Claire, a small box of books I thought she'd enjoy, when I noticed a woman a few steps ahead turning to glance at me. She was one of Daniel's cousins by marriage, though I couldn't recall her name. She whispered something to the man beside her, and they both gave me that look, a mix of pity and judgment. At the hardware store later, I ran into Henry, an old neighbor who'd once borrowed my ladder and kept it for 6 months. He gave me a half smile. "Heard there's trouble in paradise," he said, as if expecting me to confirm some juicy detail. "There's no trouble," I replied, reaching for the light bulbs I needed. "Just me finally using my own front door instead of letting everyone walk through it without knocking." He chuckled awkwardly, clearly unsure if I was joking. I wasn't, but the clearest sign of the rumors came that evening when Claire called. Her voice was low, as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "Grandpa," she said, "Mom's telling everyone you've changed, that you're paranoid and making decisions you'll regret. She even hinted you might not be thinking clearly." I let out a slow breath. "And do you believe that, Claire?" "Of course not," she said quickly. "I just hate hearing it. They make it sound like you've lost your mind. That's what people say when they can't control you anymore," I told her. "If you're not doing what they want, you must be not yourself." There was a pause on the line. I wish I could tell them to stop. "You don't need to defend me," I said gently. "You know the truth. That's enough." Still, I could feel the sting of it after we hung up. Not because I doubted myself, but because I could see the strategy so clearly. If they couldn't guilt me back into compliance, they'd try to discredit me. The next day, David and I went for a walk through the park. The air was crisp, the leaves just starting to turn. "They're making you out to be some kind of villain, aren't they?" he asked without looking at me. "Yes," I said, "but I've stopped worrying about it. I don't have to convince anyone. I just have to live the way I know is right." David smiled faintly. "You've always been a stubborn old bull, Arthur, but now it's different. You're calm about it." "I think that's what's unsettling them," I admitted. "I'm not shouting, I'm not begging, I'm just done, and that's harder to fight against than anger." That evening, I made myself a quiet dinner. Roast chicken, steamed vegetables, nothing fancy, and ate it by the kitchen window while the sun set. For the first time in years, I wasn't checking my phone during meals, waiting for some urgent family request. The silence was peaceful, the kind of peaceful that it tells you you've made the right choice, even if the road ahead will have bumps. As I rinsed my plate, I thought of something my grandmother used to say. "If you stop feeding the stray cats, don't be surprised when they start hissing at you." It wasn't cruelty, it was truth. And now I understood it better than ever. They could hiss all they liked. I wasn't putting the saucer back out. The family meeting came sooner than I expected. Claire was the one who tipped me off. She sent me a quick text on Friday morning. "Grandpa, Mom's planning to have everyone over Sunday to clear the air. She says it's about fixing things, but it's definitely about the money. Be ready." I smiled at the screen. Ready? I'd been ready since the night of that dinner. When Sunday arrived, I didn't rush. I wore what I felt comfortable in. Soft wool trousers, a crisp button-down shirt, and the watch Eleanor had given me on our 25th anniversary. If they were going to confront me, they could do it while looking at a man who carried himself with dignity. Lauren's living room was already full when I walked in. Daniel sat stiffly in an armchair, his arms folded. Lauren was on the couch, flanked by her sister Patricia and two of Daniel's cousins. Claire sat near the corner, her eyes meeting mine with a silent warning. "Stay steady." "Arthur," Lauren began, gesturing toward an empty chair, "we're glad you could come. We think it's important to have an open, honest discussion about what's been going on." I sat, folding my hands in my lap. "By all means." Daniel cleared his throat. "Dad, we're concerned. The changes you've made, the transfers, the will, everything. They seem extreme. We just want to understand why you're doing this." "You want to understand?" I said calmly. "All right, for years I've been giving money, time, help without complaint, without condition. And over those years, I've been met with less and less respect. That ends now." Patricia leaned forward. "I'm sure no one meant to make you feel that way." "Patricia," I interrupted, "whether they meant it or not doesn't change the reality. Intentions don't erase actions." Lauren's voice was measured, but I could hear the strain. "We're family. Families help each other." "Yes," I said. "Families help each other, not just one man being the perpetual ATM while being treated like a burden when he has nothing left to give." Daniel sighed as if I were being unreasonable. "Dad, you're going to cause a rift that can't be repaired." "There already is a rift," I replied. "The only difference is that I'm not pretending it's not there anymore." The room was quiet for a moment. Claire looked down at her hands, hiding a small smile. Lauren tried one last approach. "If this is about that comment at dinner, it's not about one comment," I said. "It's about years of comments, years of expectations, years of being taken for granted. And it's about me deciding I will not live the rest of my life that way." One of the cousins muttered something under their breath. I didn't bother asking them to repeat it. I'd heard enough. "I didn't come here to negotiate," I said, standing. "I came to make it clear that my decisions are final. My finances are my own. My will is my own, and my boundaries are my own. None of those things are open for discussion. Daniel's voice hardened. So that's it. You're just cutting us out. I'm cutting out the behavior that's been bleeding me dry, I said. If that means certain people see less of me, then so be it. I turned to leave, catching Claire's eye. She gave me the faintest nod, her face a careful mask. As I reached the door, Lauren's voice followed me, sharp now. You're making a huge mistake, Arthur. One day you'll regret this. I paused with my hand on the knob. No, I said quietly. I regret waiting this long. Then I walked out into the crisp afternoon air, feeling the weight of that room fall away with every step toward my car. They'd wanted a meeting to bring me back in line. Instead, they'd gotten a clear answer. I was already gone. The Sunday meeting left a residue, not the kind that clings in guilt or doubt, but the kind that reminds you of exactly why you made your decision in the first place. On Monday morning, I woke to a house that felt unusually light. It was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of the maple outside my bedroom window. I made coffee, buttered a slice of toast, and realized that for the first time in years, I didn't have to check my calendar to see which of their errands I was expected to run. Mid-morning, I drove to the community center for my volunteer shift in the library, sorting books, helping an older gentleman find a large print copy of his favorite mystery novel. It was simple, satisfying work, and not once did I feel like someone was waiting for me to finish so they could ask for something. David stopped by near the end of my shift. Heard about your big Sunday showdown, he said with a grin. Patricia's version of events made it sound like you stormed out of there with flames shooting from your ears. I chuckled. If standing up and telling the truth counts as storming, then yes, I suppose I did. You're not rattled. Not even a little, I said. I told them my decisions are final. Whether they believe me or not isn't my concern. When I got home, I found a small envelope wedged into my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note in Claire's familiar script. Proud of you. Don't let them wear you down. Dinner soon. My treat. I smiled so wide my cheeks hurt. It wasn't the money, though. I knew dinner on her would probably mean a modest cafe. It was the intent. She understood that this was about more than finances. It was about self-respect. That evening, I treated myself to a long bath, the kind where you let the water go tepid before finally stepping out. I put on fresh pajamas, brewed a cup of chamomile tea, and sat in my favorite chair by the window. The phone rang twice, Daniel both times. I let it go to voicemail. I didn't even bother listening. I'd learned that not every call deserved an answer, and not every crisis was mine to solve. Later, I wrote in my journal something I hadn't done in years. Day one without apology, day one of choosing me first. It struck me how foreign that felt, to consider myself without first measuring what someone else needed from me. When I finally went to bed, I lay there thinking about how they might try again. Another meeting, more gossip, maybe even a peace offering designed to pull me back into the same old patterns. But I also thought about something my grandmother used to say. Once you've locked your door, it doesn't matter how many times someone knocks, you get to choose if you open it. And my door for now was staying shut. A week passed after the Sunday meeting, and the storm finally began to lose some of its force. The phone still rang every couple of days, but the frequency was dropping. The text from Daniel had shifted from, "We need to talk," to, "Can we try again?" and then finally to silence. Lauren hadn't shown up in person since that morning in my driveway, and for that, I was grateful. Claire visited on Saturday afternoon. She came in without knocking, carrying a paper bag that smelled like cinnamon. "From that bakery you like," she said, pulling out 2 still warm apple turnovers. We ate them at the kitchen table, the flaky pastry scattering crumbs between us. She told me about her classes, her plans for college, and the part-time job she'd just landed at the bookstore. "They're not happy with me," she admitted after a while, for not taking sides, but I told them I was taking a side. "Yours?" I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I'm not asking you to choose between us, Claire. You shouldn't have to." "I know," she said, "but you're the only one treating me like I can think for myself, and I don't like how they talk about you." "People talk," I said. "They've always talked. The important thing is that you know the truth, and I know the truth. That's enough for me." She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I could see the weight she was carrying, the tension of being stuck between loyalty to her parents and respect for her grandfather. I didn't want her to carry it forever. After she left, I took a walk in the garden. The roses I'd planted last spring were holding on, a few stubborn blooms still catching the last warmth of the season. I thought about how much work it took to keep them alive. Pruning, watering, watching for signs of disease, and how the care had to be consistent, not just when it was convenient. That was the thing about relationships too. Without steady care, they withered, and sometimes you had to cut back the dead branches so the plant could breathe again. The following Monday, a letter arrived from Daniel. Not an email, not a text. A letter in his handwriting, folded neatly into a plain white envelope. "Dad," it began, "I'm sorry. I can see now that we've been taking too much from you without giving enough back. I'm not going to pretend I understand everything you're feeling, but I want to try. If you're willing, I'd like to visit. Just me, no Lauren, and talk. No money, no requests, just a conversation." I read it twice. There was no guarantee it wasn't just another tactic, but there was also a part of me, the part that still remembered teaching him to ride a bike, that wanted to believe he meant it. 2 days later, he came by. He didn't wear the guarded expression I'd seen so often in recent years. He just looked tired. "I've been thinking," he said, sitting at the table, "about how much you've done for us and how little we've done for you. I don't expect you to forget it, all the bad moments, but I don't want the rest of our time together to be defined by them." I listened without interrupting. When he was done, I said, "Daniel, I'm willing to have a relationship with you, but it has to be on different terms. My boundaries aren't going to vanish because we share blood. If you can respect them, we can move forward. If not, then we'll keep our distance." He nodded slowly. "I can try." "Trying is a start," I said. We talked for an hour about his work, the kids, even a little about Eleanor. There were no requests, no veiled hints, just words, tentative but honest. When he left, I stood at the window and watched him drive away. I didn't know if the change would last, but I knew one thing: I had reclaimed my place in my own life. And as I turned back toward the quiet of my home, I thought about how many years I'd lived waiting for permission to reclaim my autonomy. Now I didn't wait. I stood, I stayed standing, and I intended to keep it that way for however many years I had left. If you're reading this and you've been living in the shadow of someone else's expectations, waiting for them to value you, waiting for them to give you back the dignity they've chipped away, stop waiting, step forward. It's your life. You get to live it on your terms.